Item number 6 on our agenda, opposition to medical marijuana. That may be a mistake on the agenda, but I know we're going to be talking about medical marijuana. The distinguished back row that's here that can testify, please come forward and have a seat. We have, I'm always afraid I'm going to mess the names up. I know Michael Fletcher, who's a doctor and president of the Kentucky Society of Addiction Medicine. We have an out-of-town guest, Kevin Sabet. He's director of drug policy. And I'm going to ask Representative Kim Moser to read his bio because I think it's important. He came in from out of town today, a very distinguished guest, and I think it's important that the members know who they have before them. If you would, Representative Moser.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Dr. Sabet. We really appreciate your coming in today. Dr. Kevin Sabet is described by NBC as the prodigy of drug politics and policy. Kevin Sabet, PhD, is the author, consultant, former advisor to 3 U.S. presidential administrations, assistant professor, and serves as the president and CEO of SAM, which he founded with former Congressman Patrick Kennedy in 2013. He has studied, researched, written about, and implemented drug policy for almost 20 years, having received his doctorate from Oxford University as a Marshall Scholar. He has worked in the Clinton 2000, Bush 2002 to 2003 administrations, and in 2011 he stepped down as serving more than 2 years as the senior advisor to President Obama's drug control policy director, having been the only drug policy staffer to ever have served as a political appointee in a Democrat and Republican administration. He's the author of the book Reefer Sanity: 7 Great Myths About Marijuana, published by Beaufort. Thank you very much for being here. We are honored to have you, and we look forward to your presentation.
Again, I want to thank you. I know it hasn't been easy for you to get here with the weather and your schedule and the back and forth of your travel plans, so welcome to this committee. Just so the members know, my goal is to be out of here by 11:15. So if you have a question, write it down, and if we have to stay longer, we will. Introduce yourselves for the record and proceed with your testimony.
Thank you, thank you, Chairman Moser, our Chairman and Representative Moser. I appreciate being invited here again. My name is Kevin Sabet. I'm the President, CEO of SAM, Smart Approaches to Marijuana, which I founded as a bipartisan policy group with former Congressman Patrick Kennedy in 2013. After the legalization of marijuana in Colorado came about. And it was clear that there was a growing industry to normalize and not just legalize, but really commercialize the heavy use of marijuana. And we assembled the top academic experts from the country, as well as others really from the UN around the world, work hand in hand with the great work here that the National Marijuana Initiative does, and even the Kentucky Office of Drug Policy, groups like Operation Unite here in your state, which is famous nationwide, and I will say around the world, and the work that they do is incredible. And partnering with groups around the country to really talk and put some sense in this very emotional issue, but that should be evidence-based, and that's of marijuana. I have not seen any bill. I'll just say that for the record. So we're not taking any position on any bill because we haven't seen it. And we're really here just to impart the facts around this issue. I will just say in the very beginning, in the outset, and I have some slides, that we are really not about criminalizing users or denying medicine that could be helpful for people, especially people who have terminal illnesses, people with severe disability and illness that may have some comfort from the components of marijuana. What we want to talk about is to make sure that we just keep in mind what the data are saying and what experience has shown, and really to separate this issue of smoked marijuana or edibles with some of the components that could be helpful. And I think that is where the science is from a global level. And we think that science, not politics, should determine medicine. We think that we have a scientific standard. Voting on medicine is a very strange precedent, but we've only seen really once before with Laetrile in this country. That didn't turn out well. Medicine should be left to scientists and, frankly, not to, in my humble opinion, the public or even elected officials or others. It should be left to the scientific process. So I'm happy to talk about this issue. I'm going to go forward on some of these. As I said, I think there are three separate issues that often get conflated, and sometimes they get conflated on purpose and sometimes not. And that's the legalization or commercialization of marijuana for any use, the use of the medicinal components of the marijuana plant. Keep in mind, the marijuana plant is highly complex. It has hundreds of components in it. Science has revealed a few of those components that we know a lot about, but we don't know about most of it. We don't even know about effects when they're together or in isolation with these components. It's a very new field. It is very different than our experience with opium and the poppy plant, which is a far less complex plant and something that we know a lot more about. Obviously, we have to separate this as well from this issue of penalizing or criminalizing individual users. And I think sometimes they get conflated and they shouldn't be. It's very difficult to answer the question is marijuana medicine? I wish I had a bumper sticker for that answer, but there really isn't one because, we don't smoke medicine, first of all. Obviously, we don't ask you to smoke opium to get the effects of morphine. We don't ask you to chew willow bark to get the effects of aspirin. Aspirin comes from the combination, as you know, of when your basically saliva mixes with willow bark. That's the effect of aspirin. We wouldn't ask you to grow willow bark in your backyard. But we do know there are marijuana-based medications that have passed FDA muster. I'm going to talk about a few of those today. And we also know, frankly, in a much more exciting vein, that there's a lot of research happening. I understand someone with 6 months to live doesn't have time to wait 10 years for research. And I think there could and should be exceptions made for those people. But that is a very limited subset of what we have seen around the country with medical marijuana programs. And in fact, I want to talk a little bit in my outline about what happens when a state legalizes, some of the current regulatory failures, and then we would be amiss to not talk about the connection of marijuana and opioids, which has been something that obviously has had a lot of coverage lately for good reason. Marijuana is a Schedule I drug. According to the federal government, it has just been reviewed by FDA. I think it was a few years ago. FDA went through an exhaustive, what they call 8-factor analysis with zero input from the Department of Justice. It's only HHS and the Food and Drug Administration that does the scientific review. And this was, I believe, at the end of the Obama administration was that scientific review. The scientific review concluded there's no basis to reschedule the entire marijuana plant. It's grown in so many different ways. We have unknown components. Again, we don't smoke any medicine. A lot of reasons why it didn't pass muster, but we do have components that have passed FDA muster. Some of them are Schedule III drugs. Hundreds of people are researching marijuana every day. There's a bit of a misnomer that you're not allowed to research it because it's illegal. If that was the case, we would know nothing about heroin. We would know nothing about LSD. We would know nothing about MDMA. We know a lot about those drugs, even though they're Schedule I. I am a proponent, and I know that's not what this is about, of expanding research, making it easier. I think most researchers who want to look at this are doing it in good faith. We should make it easier to do so. Other countries like Israel have done that. There are ways to do that. I think that's a reform we could definitely look at. We have approved cannabinoid, which are the components of marijuana that are active, products that are available today. One of them is called Marinol. It's been around for 30 years. There are generics there. It's not very popular, but it's there if you need it. Frankly, thank God, AIDS wasting syndrome is no longer a public health emergency in the United States. If you have access to heart medication in the U.S. and you have HIV, you're living a normal life expectancy, which is an incredible thing from science that thankfully we've been delivered. So this issue of wasting, et cetera, is not as common. We have seen Marinol, which is THC, be helpful for nausea related to cancer chemotherapy. And I would say that's one of the strongest places where something like THC has been found to be effective. We have another synthetic THC analog called Sesamit, the Nabalone. We now have a new drug, the third one, called Epidiolex. That's cannabidiol, and it's used to treat, and right now the FDA has just approved it to treat a few very rare disorders related to epilepsy. And I'll talk more about epilepsy a little bit later, but we have seen that that's been safe and effective by FDA. We're waiting for the Department of Justice to schedule Epidiolex. And then there's something that has had starts and stops, fits and starts, I guess I should say, called Sativex, which is an extract of marijuana that is a 1-to-1 CBD, cannabidiol, doesn't get you high, THC, acts on your THC receptors in the brain and body. Medication. It's been approved in almost 36 countries. It has had trouble getting approval in the U.S. for a number of reasons. One is recruiting late-stage cancer patients and other patients who want to take this drug is not been easy to do. And you can invite somebody from that company to talk about it. But that's going through the process. I think they're going to start to do that a little bit more and try to get that through. We thought that would be approved before Epidiolex, but actually Epidiolex came first. There are many different types of epilepsy syndromes. We're not going to go through them today. The Lennox-Gastaut and Dravet are together about 8 to 9% of the types of epilepsy syndromes, and those two are the ones that the FDA has approved Epidiolex for. As I said, we're waiting for DEA. There are other companies also putting through CBD. This is CBD they create in a laboratory versus the CBD that is grown for Epidiolex. Those are two different things. But what can't medical marijuana do? Because I think there's a misnomer that marijuana, if it's medicalized, is easily regulated. I would challenge that. I don't think it's easily regulated at all. It's very, very difficult. There's a reason we don't have state FDAs. There's a reason we have one federal FDA. Because it's a very difficult thing to do, and the resources you often need from multiple agencies and multiple officials. It's difficult on a state level to devote the resources to ensure there are no contaminants, to ensure that you're getting what you think you are getting. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. But there is a misnomer that there's some difference between medical and recreational marijuana when oftentimes the products are sold very similarly. In Colorado, after they legalized marijuana, basically what most stores did is install a curtain in the middle of the recreational store, separated identical inventory. One had a green cross on it, one didn't. One was taxed higher, one wasn't. They said this is medical and this isn't. That's not really what I would think we would want sick and dying people to have to go through. We want them to go to their pharmacist, their doctor, somebody not with a expertise in using a lot of marijuana, but with actually an expertise in medication. I think that is clear. Now, there may be exceptions. I think there are exceptions with some medication. I frankly could care less if somebody with 6 months to live wants to use anything, let alone marijuana. But we have to create public policy for everybody, and it's important we understand. There have been wild claims that we have to discuss for marijuana that have been really wild, and don't take it from me, take it from the American Medical Association, which we often partner with, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the Society of Addiction Medicine, the Psychiatric Association, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, for example, to treat depression. We know that in the short term, it's possible that THC, because of what it does to your memory, because it makes some people feel very good. That's the point of it. It gets you high. We know that in some people in the short term, they could feel better from something like this. But the long-term studies show, especially if heavy users are involved, that depression and things like anxiety, things like very scary things, much scarier than even those things like schizophrenia, are associated significantly. We have seen wild claims from companies about a cure-alls for cancer. Again, the evidence shows the nausea related to chemotherapy, there could be some relief, and we need to look at that. But when it comes to whole cancer, this is, I think, very problematic. You can go on websites and see the claims: brain cancer, headaches, writer's cramp, on and on. It's been very difficult, frankly, for the FDA to keep up with these claims. It's almost impossible. They'd have to devote all their resources to do that. We've seen television doctors and others promote what I would call infomercials for marijuana, purporting for curing all kinds of things. And again, I think there is promise. Let me be very clear. With the medical potential of the components of marijuana, I think there is promise there. But the claims that are often being made are well outside the bounds of what science is saying. This is a picture of one of those items I talked about that has been approved. It's almost a pure cannabidiol. And the current situation is that right now many groups are trying to sell or give away CBD or related drugs without going through the FDA process. There's really no safety assurances, and I worry about that. The one time FDA has really looked into these things, it was a little scary what they found. What they found 2 years in a row was when they did random testing of about a few dozen CBD products that were sold on Amazon, sold online and other places. They found with most of those products it did not contain the CBD that it claimed it contained. And it actually contained a lot of THC and a lot of heavy metals, pesticides, molds, bacteria, and other things that we would never want in a medication. So I worry about when you don't have that oversight. It's important to just know when we do surveys of who's using medical marijuana that often the average user is not whom you'd imagine. The average user is an otherwise healthy, usually young male with no history of life-threatening disease. And I think it's important to really look at, when you're looking at a medical marijuana program, is it going to be the programs that we've seen west of the Mississippi, which really have been the Wild West? Or is it going to be the programs that we've seen, in places like New York or other states where, they've, I think, made lemonade with lemons, and they've kind of tried to make it a little bit more secure. But it's very difficult to even do that. And what happens when a state legalizes, we often see a cycle, and I think it's important to understand the cycle. It starts with medical marijuana. It does give cover for the black market, especially if you have a lot of home growing. It increases supply. It lowers the price. The black market undercuts the legal price. So the black market is thriving in a lot of these states. We see adulterated products in a lot of these black market materials like fentanyl and others. We then see the lobbyists come on board, and let me tell you, the lobbyists are not wearing hemp T-shirts and have ponytails. They're not late to their meetings. They're not forgetting a lot of things because they're not really using marijuana. They are Ivy League MBAs with one goal and one goal only, and that's to make money. And I really worry when it comes to the commercialization. When Woodstock becomes Wall Street, I start to worry. I went to Berkeley as an undergrad. That wasn't mentioned. I saw plenty of which was great. I mean, I love those guys, but they're not in the marijuana business, folks. They're still, playing drums and singing Kumbaya on Sproul Plaza, which is wonderful. The folks in the marijuana business are the ones in Silicon Valley, 1 hour south of me in Berkeley, who are there to make money, who are people I went to grad school with, who are, very smart people. And I worry that we are commercializing this and just going way too fast. More locations as a result of relaxed regulations, and then we see recreational legalization. It's a cycle we have seen in state after state after state, and I think we have to worry about that. Oklahoma shows us exactly what happens. They had medical marijuana pass there because most people think it's about cancer and epilepsy, and I can understand that. This is not a top issue for most of the public. So when they're asked by pollsters a very simplistic question, do you agree with medical marijuana for the sick? Well, 90% are going to say yes. Because if you're truly sick and dying, I don't care if you're using medical, methamphetamine if you have 6 months to live. But the issue becomes the devil's in the details. And in Oklahoma, when they passed medical marijuana, it did not take more than 2 days for a recreational ballot initiative by the same group to be announced. So it sort of shows where often this is going. I will leave for the committee because I know I want to be able to take questions. There's issues related to crime and marijuana stores and youth use. There are a lot of studies on that. There are issues, people have a dream that maybe if you use marijuana, you'll reduce your alcohol consumption and you'll be less violent or you won't have cirrhosis or whatnot. We actually haven't seen that at all. In fact, the alcohol business is now getting into the pot business in a major way. And Constellation Brands, for example, just bought $4 billion stake in the largest medical marijuana company in Canada. They know people use these products together. They're not competing. And for them, this is really about that. I worry about the driving impacts, which, again, I don't want to go into a lot of detail with, but it's not a surprise that if you're stoned, you have not great reflexes, and you're slower in your reaction time, and your brain isn't working as fast as it normally would. That is a problem when you drive. We've seen a lot of things in Colorado as a result of this, which, again, I will leave with you all, whether it's use levels, whether it's college students and the effects, whether it's the workplace. I hope any legislation you look at, you think about what happens if an employee tests positive and tells an employer that they have a right to use. on the job and that the employer can't prove that they were high at the time. It's a big problem with THC marijuana because THC is fat soluble and it stays in your system longer than alcohol does. And that becomes very, very tricky. It's a very tricky issue for the workplace. If you're looking for a one-stop shop to hear about some of the scientific associated issues, please don't take my word for it. You should read the National Academy of Sciences, which is the largest and best compilation of researchers looking at this issue. You can read that for yourself. They identified all kinds of physical and mental health issues from, basically the heavy use of marijuana. There have been a lot of regulatory failures. I think it's important the committee understands, whether it comes to the illicit market and cartels who often use licenses as a cover for other operations, increased access for minors, a big one being pesticides and contaminants. There is there's a misconception that if it's legal, then it's regulated. If it's legal, that means we're looking at all the items. If it's legal, it means that you're not going to get adulterated items. That has not been the case in any of these states. And it's important to look at that. And it's very important to look at the lack of medical expertise and what that means for the citizens of your state. I'm going to cheat and talk about this issue, the last one about pregnant women before the others, because it's so egregious. A scientific study came out last month finding that 70% of marijuana dispensaries in Colorado recommended marijuana to pregnant women in their first trimester. That is a huge problem because, first of all, they're not referring them to their doctors. They're not using evidence. And secondly, we actually know the opposite, that marijuana is, and THC is extremely dangerous for pregnant women and for unborn children. And it's something that this is what happens when you put an industry who puts often profits before health. This is what happens when they're in charge and not medical professionals. We've seen foreign cartels embrace home-grown marijuana in pot legal states. They love it if you do home-grown marijuana, especially if you have a high amount. Now, if you have a tiny amount, that's one thing. If you have a high amount, and we know that one marijuana plant can be a tree these days, we have seen foreign cartels be
Doctor, I don't mean to interrupt
Sure.
you. I'm just trying to manage the time here. How much longer to your presentation?
How about 3 to 5 minutes?
Perfect. Thank you.
Great. So we know the cartels are taking full advantage of Colorado's marijuana laws. The legal growers really it's a headache for law enforcement. Again, I'll leave all of this to you. You will be promised from slick companies that they can do seed to sale tracking. Good luck with that. The loopholes involved are very, very worrisome. And again, you can read the evidence we've seen. Sales to minors, a huge issue. We're constantly seeing law enforcement having to devote resources to this. And imagine what they're not able to get to is really what I like to talk about. And we're often talking not about joints these days, but about the edibles, the gummy bears, the cookies, the ice creams, the sodas, things that most people don't associate marijuana with. That's kind of the new way because, frankly, as you all know, in a tobacco state like Kentucky, the popularity of smoking cigarettes has declined. And so a lot of young people will say, we'll never smoke cigarettes, but then we'll vape with THC, we'll dab with 99% THC. We'll use the edibles. We'll use non-smokable materials, and that's really been increasing a lot. States are failing to regulate pesticide use. Here's a list of some of just in the last couple of years, of some of the non-publicized. And I say non-publicized because it's not in the interest of the state often to publicize a lot of these, sadly. They were just compiled on the website, if you happen to go to this obscure webpage on Colorado State website, finding the recalls of the marijuana products because of pesticides. Non-food grade ingredients, pesticide residue, bacteria, mold, on and on and on. I'm going to finish up and just say that I worry of expanding marijuana use during an opiate epidemic. There have been studies that show, well, maybe marijuana use gets reduced opioid use gets reduced if you use marijuana. Those have been largely debunked by top researchers who are finding that actually, if you look, for example, just last month, this month, or August, their findings disconfirmed the hypothesis that medical marijuana and prescription drug harms occur. And so they are very, very worried about marijuana leading to some of these other drugs. So I'm going to end there, except I guess I'll have my last slide just that takes it home for you. just in case you didn't know, that the former CEO of Purdue Pharma, the guy that created the business plan for OxyContin that killed hundreds of thousands of people, millions of families affected, he jumped ship and he's now the head of a medical marijuana company. I think if that doesn't explain what this is often about, really nothing else will. So I'm going to end there.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you so much, Chairman.
You're welcome. Thank you for that presentation. We're going to get back to you. We got lots of questions, but I want my friend Dr. Michael Fletcher is here, president of the Kentucky Society for Addiction Medicine, and I understand you have a very short presentation.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Good morning. My name is Michael Fletcher. I'm a graduate of the University of Louisville School of Medicine. I've held a Kentucky medical license actively since 1995. I'm board certified in the areas of anesthesiology, pain management, and addiction medicine. I practice in Northern Kentucky and currently serve on the Kentucky Board of Medical Licensure, as well as the Chief Medical Officer for Addiction Recovery Care Centers. Additionally, I've served as a United States Air Force flight surgeon in the Kentucky Air National Guard, 123rd Airlift Wing, and am now president-elect of Kentucky Society of Addiction Medicine. I'd also like to say that I have no financial disclosures to make regarding any relationship with pharmaceutical entities or the FDA. As an addiction medicine physician, I'm here to champion the implementation of safeguards in all jurisdictions where marijuana has been legalized or may be legalized in the future. My comments today reflect the public policy position stated by ASAM, the American Society of Addiction Medicine, the premier organization recognized for leadership in areas pertaining to addiction medicine. ASAM does not support the legalization of marijuana and recommends that jurisdictions that have not yet acted to legalize it be most cautious and not adopt a policy of legalization until more can be learned from the natural experiments now underway in jurisdictions that have already legalized it. Also, ASAM supports the use of cannabinoids in cannabis for medical purposes only when governed by appropriate safety and monitoring regulations such as those established by FDA research and post-marketing surveillance processes. ASAM asserts cannabis-based products, and Dr. Sabat's already mentioned some of these drug delivery issues that are very bizarre and outside of normal modern practice of medicine. That delivery devices should be subject to the same safety and efficacy standards applicable to all other prescription medications. Such products should not be distributed or otherwise provided to patients unless they have received marketing approval. In general, any product purported to be a medicine should look like a medicine, like a pill or a capsule or a wafer, not to be appearing in candy or food. And ASAM rejects smoking as a means of drug delivery. We also support research on marijuana and various cannabinoids present in marijuana and synthetic agonists and antagonists, including both science and clinical research. I would like to briefly make a point of clarification. It has been recently stated in some of these public hearings recently related to this topic that Senator McConnell is actively seeking to have marijuana changed from a C1 to a C2 medication. Perhaps this was an inadvertent comment. It is very misleading and inaccurate. The policy initiatives regarding the legalization of hemp as an agricultural product should not be confused with the legalization of marijuana. And finally, it's important to know that multiple other highly reputable public health care organizations have gone on record in agreement with what we're presenting to you today. An excellent summary statement regarding this very important topic has been made by Dr. Christian Thurstone, a board-certified psychiatrist in adolescent addiction medicine in Colorado. She said, "In the absence of credible data, this debate of being dominated by bad science and misinformation from people interested in using medical marijuana as a step toward the legalization of recreational use. Bypassing the FDA's well-established approval process has created a mess and especially affects children and adolescents. Young people who are clearly being targeted with medical marijuana advertising and diversion are most vulnerable to developing marijuana addiction and suffering from its lasting effects." Thank you very much.
Thank you, Doctor. We have 15 minutes now for questions and discussions. Thank you both for a great presentation. I got a couple questions. One of the things that we had a presentation I'm on a workforce development committee, and we had a very interesting presentation earlier in the summer about the high number of people who are on disability in Kentucky and how that number has gone up 300% in the last 15 years. It has gone up 300%, the number of people on disability. I was reading about some of the states who have legalized medical marijuana, and that they had this huge spike in males between the age of 18 and about 35 filing for disability. I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on this or any comments. That's my first question.
Sure. To be honest, Chairman, there has not been a lot of data on that, and that's why we do use, and I use it too, like Dr. Fletcher, the word experiment. We sort of, when you say experiment, especially in the scientific world, we assume that means we're actually looking at data. And I got to say, and it's not Republican, Democrat, whatever it is, I think both are guilty. There has not been a good look at a lot of the data. We have to scrounge around to find even use data that's relevant, because a lot of these states didn't even set up proper surveillance systems for very basic things until after legalization, if they had something before legalization, the one afterwards they changed it so it's not even comparable to the past. So I've heard that too, Chairman, but I haven't seen a lot of the data on it. I also, obviously, we cannot divorce these drugs from each other. When people talk about an opioid epidemic, I often talk about actually an addiction epidemic, because these drugs are all often used together, and very few instances is somebody using heroin as their first drug of abuse. Very few. Most of the time it's alcohol and or marijuana. And we have to look at these things together. And so data like on the disability issue, I think we'd actually have to look at all the drugs having probably a major impact on that.
With heroin, you call it an epidemic. This is where Representative Moser and I have a bit of a disagreement. I call it a crime wave, but they're
there you go.
Yeah, bit of a difference.
Could
But
be
the next question I want to ask you is, we're legislators from varied backgrounds, business people, farmers, all kinds of different backgrounds, and I think many of us are very, very conflicted about this issue, because we have friends. We don't want, we're against government overreach,
Right.
but we want to protect people. We're just very conflicted. I know I am.
Understand.
Okay, you as a physician and your vast experience and knowing everything you know gave us in this presentation and more. What is your opinion as far as should a state legalize marijuana or not?
So just as a social scientist, is my doctorate, the physician is to my right. So if you ask me what the tickle in your throat is, I couldn't tell you because I'm a PhD, unfortunately. But yes, as somebody who studied this as a social scientist for over 20 years, my position is unequivocally that we should not legalize marijuana. We have a hard enough time with our legal drugs. We know what happens when special interest groups come in. That doesn't mean we lock people up in prison, give them a criminal record. That doesn't mean that we have to be extreme on the other side for low-level amounts if you're talking about more of a libertarian point of view of a small amount here and there. That's different than the widespread commercialization of marijuana.
Thank you. Thank you for that direct answer. I appreciate that. And then lastly, if we were to legalize medical marijuana, and maybe you can't do this, but if you can, please do. If we were to legalize medical marijuana, is there one or two states that you could point to that you feel like, if you did do it, did a pretty darn good job of it?
I think if you look at, and they're having a lot of problems still, but again, like I said, if you look at some states that have had a very restrictive program, like actually Louisiana, who started trying to integrate it with pharmacists and the pharmacy board. If you look at, so I would look at Louisiana. I would look at perhaps New York and New Jersey pre-2016. I would say look south and east rather than look west, if I had to give a direct answer.
Thank you. We will now move on to questions. Senator Symes.
Yes, thank you very much. I find it interesting that, in the past you've heard me, this group here has heard me talk about my cancer and my granddaughter who's epileptic. And of course, when I left the hospital, they gave me this nice bottle of OxyContin. and I trashed it, and I went to the street and smoked a joint. Okay. Now, would it have been nice if I could have got, rather than off the street, that I could have went to a store and got what I would know as a clean product? Because we know they have a tendency to lace that stuff. And my granddaughter, who's epileptic, wouldn't it be nice if she wasn't criminalized and that she could have access to a clean product? You know, I was in the liquor business for many, many years, retail shops. And I go all the way back to Prohibition when we had a higher, according to one study, a higher percentage during key to the population of alcoholics during Prohibition than we have today. That's at least one study I looked at. When's the last time we heard of anybody getting a hold of rot gut whiskey? It doesn't happen because you can go to a store and get a clean product. You know what you're buying. And I have one question for Dr. Fletcher. Dr. Fletcher, are you a member of the Kentucky Medical Association? Well, I find it interesting that a good friend of mine, Dr. Donnie Stacy, who's a radiology expert, who wants this tool in his toolbox for his people, that your own KMA gave him an award for his work in medical cannabis. I find that odd that we have this conflict here. So I'm obviously an advocate. I just think that we would have access to clean products rather than getting it off the street. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're welcome. Representative Moser.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much for being here today. I very much appreciate your clarification about some of the issues and some of the questions that have come up in the past month or so since we've really started debating this in earnest. I agree with you that marijuana is a plant, like many others, that have gone through the rigorous FDA approval process to become a medication. I'm confused about why marijuana, the plant, should be treated any differently. I know that we've talked about many of the medicinal qualities that are probably in THC, and ongoing research is really what I believe should be front and center for the safety and the effectiveness. We need to know exact indications for a said medication. I would also say that it's probably not a great idea to come to the legislature for your healthcare needs. I am not a doctor, and when I am sick, I go to a doctor or a healthcare provider, not my friends in the legislature. As much as I like all of you, I'm still going to go elsewhere for my healthcare needs. So again, I very much appreciate your clarifying all of the arguments that we've heard. I believe that it's research and science, and not a collection of anecdotes and ad hominems and emotion that we need to be considering this very important issue. On the economic development side, and Chairman Fisher brought up an excellent point. I think that Kentucky in the past year or two has done an excellent job on the economic development side of really bringing more businesses to Kentucky. We have a workforce shortage as it is, and some of it is attributed to the current drug problem that we're having. Is there... I guess one question could be, is there a field sobriety test or some sort of quick test that we can do to know whether or not someone is actively under the influence of marijuana if they are on the work site?
So thank you for the question. So there are tests in development. We do not have anything near what we have for alcohol with a .08 BAC. mainly because THC metabolizes, as I said, differently in your system, and frankly, different people react in different ways. So it's very difficult to prove impairment. And with alcohol, it's frankly often can be difficult enough also to prove impairment, but we have sort of set a political standard of 0.08 that juries know, and it's very black and white. For marijuana, especially when it comes to driving or the workplace, it's more subjective. And there are trying to be sensitive tests that are trying to detect recent use, which maybe we'll get there, but we're not quite there yet, to be honest.
Okay.
Is it, Mr. Chair, if I could just make another comment?
You may.
Thank you. I just wanted to say to Senator Simon, I mean, I very much sympathize with your situation. I also have family members in the same situation as yours. I'm very glad to see you here and healthy and talking about something that you're passionate about, and I respect that. I think actually we're on the same page in many ways. I don't think that anybody wants to see adulterated products. I worry about the legal stores in Colorado that are getting away with selling a lot of adulterated products. I also worry about the black market that's selling adulterated products. I want folks in your position and the position of your dear granddaughter to have access to that medication from an authority, from someone who can assure them that they are getting something that is what they think it is. Nobody, don't think, on this committee or in the state wants anyone to suffer needlessly. I'm curious, I guess Marinol wasn't an option for whatever reason, the THC pill that's available at a pharmacy. But beyond Marinol, I think that there could be ways where, in limited circumstances that you just described, that, again, nobody wants anyone, their worst enemy, let alone their family, to go through, that there are ways to carve out exceptions and to allow, in a more safe and regulated manner, exceptions in those circumstances. I think where it gets worrisome is when we open this up to a massive industry making very wild claims about conditions that you did not mention and selling things that we do not know and understand. But I wanted to thank you.
Thank you. We have quite a few other questions. Senator Carroll.
I know we don't have much time left, but Dr. Fletcher, I appreciate you bringing up the effort of Senator McConnell, because Senator McConnell recognizes that in the hemp industry, all he's doing is trying to legalize the growing of hemp in Kentucky, which is an enormous agricultural product for our farmers to replace tobacco. My question in regard to it, I guess, jumps to Dr. Sabet. The THC content of our hemp product at the moment is 0.3%, which is essentially none. Now, some of the processing is taking it down to zero, but the medicinal quality of hemp is not in the THC. It's rather in the crystal that's in the bud of the plant. If you know anything about hemp, I've been forced to try to do something about hemp in Kentucky because I think it's an enormous opportunity. I'd be interested in your comment.
Well, I think that I would leave it to law enforcement to tell us about, the sort of hemp-rich plants and the CBD-rich plants versus the THC plants, and how that may sort of make difficult the enforcement of growing laws, because can you easily tell them apart?
That we recognize.
Right. But I would say on hemp, I mean, good luck. I would love to see it be, to be something that works. I understand the history here, and I frankly focus on more the commercialization of these THC products, which, as you said, is very different than hemp. I know that China and Canada have had the production of hemp legal for forever, and it's a blip on their GDP and their economy. Maybe that's different than a state like Kentucky that has a concentration of this and the history of it. I think it'd be interesting to see. I know everyone's looking for the next best thing. There are fads that come in and out. I get that it's a difficult time, especially for the tobacco farmers. So I think we'll have to see what happens with it.
Thank you.
Just one quick comment, Mr. Chairman.
Very quick.
In that regard, we have found instances in which some of these hemp products are being laced with marijuana.
Yes.
And so the General Assembly in Kentucky has got to deal with the protocols for what is on the shelves out there.
That's Right.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Senator McDaniel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Sabet, thank you for traveling up here today and being with us. Dr. Fletcher, thank you. Obviously, this is a societal issue across the nation that's being grappled with. But so let me go down to a very small level, execution and operational level concern of mine as it relates to legalization. So I'm in the concrete industry. We have people that take tractor trailers, very heavy tractor trailers, big loads up and down the interstate all the time. And I always have a degree of liability as an employer, and my employees have a degree of liability for their actions behind the wheel. My concern is this. I sit in northern Kentucky, same county with Dr. Fletcher. We border Indiana and Ohio, which obviously have different frameworks than we would particularly. What are we looking at in terms of criminal or civil liability on the personal or corporate level, or what have we seen? Because frankly, it terrifies me that in the event you have somebody with a perfectly legal prescription, they cross the center line and they kill somebody or they injure somebody, there are levels of liability on a personal and corporate level. And what does that look like? And what about when you start crossing state lines with a commercial driver's license? It's obviously is federal, with a product that's not. You can see where, as an employer, and you're a small employer like me, you got 50 folks, and it's a lot to juggle. And so I'm just looking for some commentary on what that looks like.
You want me to take that? Well, Senator, it's a very complex issue and a very important one that you brought up. In fact, I just came from speaking to a national group of roofers from around the country, the biggest roofers in the country, who are very concerned with, first of all, a difficult labor pool in terms of, the flip side of low unemployment is that it's very hard to find good labor, especially laborers and workers. And number two, finding ones that can, frankly, pass a drug test and that aren't having to deal with things like probation, parole, drug testing, all the kinds of things in the middle of the day that you have to deal with when you're dealing with your actual business. I don't have a crystal ball on how this will affect it. I can tell you in other states, there's a mishmash of lawsuits that have happened. I would say regularly lawsuits are happening on the liability front, either by employees who claim to be discriminated, by employers who, claim that there have been a damage to their business as a result of drug use, mainly often with marijuana. This is a huge issue from a business perspective, and I advise businesses. I'm not a lawyer, but first of all, I say please consult a lawyer, but I also say there are drug-free workplace programs and things that you can try and do on the front end with regards to regular testing and maintaining a drug-free workplace. But in an environment where someone thinks that what they have is, first of all, legally prescribed. It is never legally prescribed. So until the Controlled Substances Act happens, using the word medical prescription is a misnomer. It's in any state, whether it's here, California, it's a recommendation. And so, because a prescription implies a legal prescription pad, DEA, FDA approved. You can't do that unless you have a marijuana improved product, those couple that I showed you today earlier. But with most of this stuff, it's not a prescription. So it's very messy. And you're going to be sitting in a lot of law offices discussing this, unfortunately, as it goes forward. It's very difficult. I don't have a better answer for you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're welcome. We have two more, Representative Wistrom and Representative Miller. Representative Wistrom, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have to say, I have a lot of skepticism about this topic simply because it's nothing new. This topic has been around for 30 years and it has been very carefully avoided by the federal government and the FDA, which makes me question why. And I can't help but think that when you look at the vast pharmaceutical industry that is a multi-billion dollar international industry, shores up our 401ks, our IRAs, our pension systems, and the federal government does not want to rock that boat. Not only that, you also have to question money. It's always about the money.
Okay.
Who gets what contribution?
Totally agree.
I don't think we're getting a fair shake at the federal level. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you. I agree. It is often about the money. And
Well, that was easy.
Yeah. Well,
Okay.
There we go.
Representative Miller. Representative Miller.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Fletcher, I think I've been in the legislature 4 years, and to my knowledge, I've voted for about everything in terms of getting control of the opioid problems that we have, greater enforcement, et cetera. I am concerned that we've gone from making it harder for people to get an FDA-regulated product, and it's driving perhaps some of our opioid deaths, because when it's harder to get a legal product, FDA-regulated product, it drives it into the black market, and that's where we get into the fentanyl. And I am getting more and more contacts from constituents saying, you know me, I'm a law-abiding citizen, we've gone to church, yada, yada. It's harder for me to get my pain medication because my primary care physician just won't do it any. He won't take the chance of winding up getting caught in a net of being a prescriber. So they're having to go to a specialist, perhaps such as yourself. Can you talk about the balance? Because that's what troubles me is, are we making it so tough in one area, it's popping out in another, like the illegal substances,
Right.
It's driving, and how does medical marijuana play into that in your mind? Some are posing it as a solution to some of the overdose death problems.
Yeah, so I'm a pain doctor. I'm an anesthesiologist, and I started doing addiction 2 or 3 or 4 years ago because I saw the correlation between chronic pain patients and people demonstrating aberrant behavior with the use of their prescription opioids. So less regulation is better in my mind as a philosophy. I sit on the board of medicine, and this occupies 90 to 95% of our time. Looking at cases where doctors did or did not do the right thing. There's always unintended consequences of legislation that's been passed. We can benchmark that 4 years ago to what's happened now. I'm all about physician autonomy, making professional judgment calls. When I see judges in the courtroom make the wrong decision, we always hear about it, right? The guy who should have been put back in jail and was let. So it's a tough call, frankly, as a practitioner. So it's doctor-patient relationship is real key, and it's not an easy answer. I will say a majority of my patients who used to shoot heroin in their arms smoke dope. Maybe 100% at one time in their life or another, just to put it in, real terms. So, and there's also comorbid psychiatric disorders, which has been referred to today. So there's a crossover between these patient populations, and there's clearly so access to care is a key issue. Doctors willing and able to do it, and then getting reimbursed to do it. Frankly, these people are uninsured. 95% of Kentucky Medicaid. There's not a lot of incentives for doctors or hospitals to do this, frankly. In the state of Kentucky, these patients are very difficult, they're non-compliant, and they're litigious. Okay, so most of them, they just are. So they're very. It's a tough call.
Thank you.
Again, not a clear answer, but I feel like over time we'll figure it out.
I think it's a great question Representative Miller raises, and I too am getting more. Well, I've always I'll be the first to say I didn't vote for all of it, and that was the reason I didn't vote for all of it, is I was very worried about so-called unintended consequences. But it's a great question. You're right. There's no easy answer to it. The last question is going to go to Representative Osborne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple brief things. This is an issue that, as most of the proponents in this room would probably tell you, my opinions have evolved a bit over the year, though I still
Can you speak up just a hair, get close to the mic? We're having trouble hearing you.
I intended it that way, Mr. Chairman. It is. I have continued to see opinions on this issue evolve over the years, and I think part of that is because it is becoming more and more prevalent throughout the country. And I think at last count there were, 26, 27 states, something like that, that have legalized some form of medicinal. At least medicinal. And you cited a number of potential problems, concerns. I think a lot of that was with the full legalization, but also a lot of concerns with with regulation and enforcement. Have there been any states that have run into problems significant enough to repeal their legislation?
Well, there have. So if you look at the early era of sort of some of these laws and liberalizing laws, you have a state like Alaska that legalized small amounts, kind of a grow your own, medical, legal. They repealed that in 1990. They recriminalized, actually, which was incredible. And then basically it went through the courts for 18 years, and then the marijuana industry saw it upon themselves to have a ballot initiative where they would fund it about $3 to $5 million. The opponents funding it less than $100,000. And with a ballot initiative and that kind of money, which goes back to your colleague on your right about the money, it really got that message that they wanted to get out there, that this was the greatest thing since sliced bread. So a lot of these things passed. I think that you have states now that are going through this debate and discussion. And it's funny, right before I got up here to testify, I got an alert. The new HHS survey of drugs was just released an hour ago. It found that we have record level. All drugs are going down with a slight uptake in cocaine among certain populations. But the big exception to all drugs going down in terms of initiation is marijuana. So you now have regular, heavy, almost daily marijuana use increasing, doubling in the last 10 years. If you think about that, we're not talking about the occasional toke. We're talking about daily. These are people that drive, that go to work, that are taking care of your kids. This is an issue. And so I worry, as you said, we have seen this expand, I think because an industry is pushing it to be expanded. And I think we need to slow down a little bit, because I do think this is something we're going to regret.
We're good at doing that in Kentucky.
And let's slow down. That's good. And let's do it in a way that's compassionate, so that, you know, Senator Sines and others and his family and himself may have access to something that's helpful to them in these specific circumstances, but that don't open the
Thank you, Doctor. Dr. Fletcher, did you have something?
So a couple.
If I could have can I have the committee's attention for just 1 minute? We're going to shut her down in just a minute. Go ahead, Doctor.
Cannabinoid receptors, CBD 1 and 2, were only recently discovered less than 20 years ago. It takes research and development for drugs a long time to develop. So unlike heroin and morphine, we knew about that back in the 50s. So to do good research has really only been recently possible.
And that's the last word on this subject. We've had great dialogue today. I want to thank the members and all our guests who testified, because this is an important subject which is not going away, and we're going to be hearing a lot more about it. I want the committee members to know we are going to have a December meeting because we have a lot more work to do, and if there are no objections, we'll stand adjourned.
You were wonderful. You were great.